I'm Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek, and this is part 2 of my discussion of the JFK assassination. If you didn't watch part 1 of the discussion, I've provided a link to it above. You might want to watch that one before diving into part 2. Within hours of Oswald's death, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said, "The thing I'm concerned about is having something issued so we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach sent a memo to Johnson's White House aide Bill Moyers recommending the formation of a presidential commission to investigate the assassination in order to combat speculation of a conspiracy. Katzenbach wrote, "The public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates who are still at large." So right from the start, the Warren Commission's purpose was stated not as getting to the truth of what happened, but as convincing the country that Oswald was the lone gunman. But the commission had a problem. The FBI was on record stating that 3 shots were fired in their December 9th report. 2 shots hit Kennedy and 1 hit Texas Governor Connally, who was sitting in front of him. But it was later brought to the Warren Commission's attention that apparently a 4th shot was fired that missed the motorcade and struck the curb on Commerce Street, a few feet away from a man named James Tague, who was struck on the cheek by a piece of concrete from the curb. If there were actually 4 shots fired, then there must have been a second gunman, because there wasn't enough time to fire 4 shots from Oswald's bolt-action rifle. And the stated objective of the Warren Commission was to present Oswald as the lone gunman. So rather than veer away from the lone gunman theory, the Warren Commission presented what is now known as the single bullet theory, that the first shot missed and the second shot struck both Kennedy and Connally. This has become known as the magic bullet theory to critics of the Warren Commission because it's highly unlikely that a bullet would do what this bullet supposedly did. Many people have heard of the magic bullet theory, but not as many are aware that Governor Connally rejected it. He insisted that the bullet that struck him was different from the first one that struck Kennedy. And LBJ didn't believe it either. Nor did Senator Richard Russell, who was one of the 7 members of the Warren Commission. In this recording, LBJ and Senator Russell both stated as much.
Well, they were trying to prove that the same bullet that hit Kennedy first was the one that hit Connally. Went through him and through his hand, his bone, and into his leg.
Well, what difference did it make which bullet got Connally?
Well, it don't make much difference, but they said that they believe, that the commission believed that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
And so I couldn't sign it. And I said that Governor Connally testified directly to the contrary, and I'm not going to approve of that. So I finally made them say there was a difference in the commission in that. Part of them believed that wasn't so. And, of course, if a fellow was accurate enough to hit Kennedy right in the neck on one shot and knock his head off the next one when he was leaning up against his wife's head and not even wound up, well, he didn't miss completely with that 3rd shot. According to that theory, he not only missed the whole automobile, but he missed the street.
So it's not just conspiracy nuts who reject the single bullet theory. And since there were only 3 shell casings found on the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository where Oswald allegedly fired from, if you reject the single bullet theory, you have to conclude that there was at least 1 shot coming from another rifle fired by another person in another location. A conspiracy. But the Warren Commission stuck with the single bullet theory and the lone gunman theory, warts and all. So if somebody else was shooting, who was it? Well, there are several good candidates. One is Charles Nicoletti, also known as Chucky the Typewriter, a Chicago mob associate and hitman for Sam Giancana, who was involved in the plot to kill Castro. He was shot in the back of the head 3 times shortly before he was scheduled to appear before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977. He died the same day that George de Mohrenschildt died. De Mohrenschildt, coincidentally, was also scheduled to appear before the committee at the time. Another possibility is John Saltrak, a French-Canadian who entered the country on November 19th and was deported on December 2nd. Saltrak was reportedly in Dallas on the day of the assassination, but he never confessed, and the evidence against him is mostly circumstantial. Then there's E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, both CIA men who were involved in the Watergate break-in that led to Nixon's resignation. Rumors of their involvement began when comedian Dick Gregory said that they looked like two of the three hobos detained after the shooting. Both were said to have confessed to participating in the assassination, but Sturgis was a notorious liar, and E. Howard Hunt only confessed to knowledge of the plot, not any actual participation in it. Hunt's confession was supposedly given on his deathbed to his drug-addicted son, who wasn't credible. Beyond that, I see no real evidence tying either one of them to the shooting. And finally, the most likely shooter, in my opinion, was Herminio Diaz Garcia, a bodyguard for Giancana, who had also worked for Miami crime boss Santo Trafficante. He was a skilled marksman and assassin who died a couple of years after the JFK assassination in a failed mission in Cuba. He reportedly confessed to a couple of associates his participation in shooting Kennedy. It's my belief that Oswald fired 3 times, shooting Governor Connally once and missing the limo completely with the other 2 shots. I believe that Diaz and another shooter were positioned on the west end of Dealey Plaza, one from behind the fence in the grassy knoll and the other from across Elm Street near the railroad track. It's hard to say definitively who all was shooting besides Oswald, but frankly, I'm not so concerned about who pulled the triggers as I am who pulled the strings. Who set this thing up? I have no doubt that the mafia initiated it and provided the assassin or assassins, but they couldn't have pulled it off on their own. Despite being known as organized crime, they're not all that organized. To pull this off, you would need people within the intelligence community to provide the fall guy and the cover-up. When you start looking into the intelligence world, 3 names keep coming up. First of all is Allen Dulles, the CIA director that JFK fired. Somehow he ended up on the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of the man who fired him, a man that he despised. Does that make sense? And to top that off, Dulles was at Camp Peary on the day of the assassination. Camp Peary is a military site in Virginia that hosts a covert CIA training facility called The Farm. How does he gain admission into a facility like that 2 years after he was fired? Seems odd, doesn't it? Another name that comes up is Charles A. Willoughby, the head of military intelligence under Douglas MacArthur during World War II and the Korean War. He was blamed for underestimating China's participation in the Korean War and was relieved of duty in 1951. He was known for his strong anti-communist views and had worked with Texas oil tycoon H.L. Hunt on the International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture, an extreme right organization. Another name is CIA officer Bill Harvey, who was known for his participation in Operation Mongoose, a CIA program to force the ouster of or assassinate Fidel Castro. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert Kennedy told CIA Director John McCone to end all covert operations aimed at Cuba. He later discovered that Bill Harvey had ignored this order and had dispatched 3 commando teams into Cuba to prepare for what he believed would be an inevitable invasion. Robert Kennedy was furious, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Harvey was dismissed from Operation Mongoose. All of these men had the knowledge of how to conduct covert operations. They were all anti-communist and anti-Castro, and they all despised Kennedy, considering him soft on communism and a threat to national security. Again, it's hard to say with any certainty what roles they might have played, But it does seem that the intelligence aspect of the assassination keeps pointing to them. I once heard a man who worked as a homicide investigator say that he decided to use his investigation skills on the JFK case. He said that in most homicide investigations, you start out with little or no idea what happened, and after interviewing a few people and gathering some evidence, you start to put the pieces together until a picture emerges of who was responsible and why and how it happened. But he said that in the JFK case, it's just the opposite. The more you look into it, the more confusing it becomes. That, to me, is an indication of a black op, a covert operation by a government agency in which the operation is hidden from the government's own scrutiny. Most of the public is unaware of the fact that Oswald went to Mexico City 2 months before the assassination to apply for a visa to Cuba. Due to the embargo against Cuba, no visas were issued in the United States, so he decided to try obtaining one in Mexico. When he ran into some red tape at the embassy, Oswald reportedly said that he would kill Kennedy to prove his loyalty to Castro. Now, I don't think the Cubans actually wanted anything to do with Oswald, but his outburst likely planted the thought in the minds of certain members of the intelligence community that he might come in handy. I believe they had anti-Castro Cubans posing as pro-Castro Cubans who approached Oswald with the promise of expediting his emigration to Cuba if he were to kill Kennedy. Oswald had no intention of being captured or killed. I'm convinced that he was convinced that a ride would be awaiting him after the shooting to take him to the airport and fly him to Houston, where another flight was awaiting him to take him to Cuba. He hopped on a bus that ended up being stuck in traffic and then exited the bus and took a cab to his boarding house instead. By this time, he probably figured out that he was set up as the fall guy. So he grabbed his jacket and a pistol and just headed out on foot. In my opinion, this was a man without a plan, just desperately trying to get away. When he was stopped by a policeman who realized that he matched the description of the suspect, Oswald fired 3 shots into his chest and 1 into his head. He then walked down the street and darted into a movie theater without paying. The police entered the theater and took him into custody for killing Officer J.D. Tippit, and after they took him to the Dallas police station, they realized that he was the man who was wanted for the assassination. This is David Ferry, an experienced pilot who flew guns to Castro's forces during their revolution against Batista. Once Castro became an ally of the Soviets, Ferry assisted the Cuban exiles in their efforts to overthrow Castro. If you saw the movie JFK, you might remember that David Ferry was questioned about his actions on the day of the assassination. He lived in New Orleans and drove from New Orleans to Houston that day. He told investigators that he wanted to go ice skating. Then he said they went goose hunting, but later admitted they didn't have any hunting rifles with them. Witnesses reported that he spent 2 hours at the skating rink standing by a payphone. I believe that Ferry was either going to fly Oswald or some other assassin out of the country. In this photo, taken when Oswald was about 14, you can see both Oswald and Ferry at a Civil Air Patrol function where Ferry was a 37-year-old instructor at the time. David Ferry apparently later worked for Carlos Marcello's attorney G. Ray Gill. Marcello, as I stated earlier, was the New Orleans crime boss who was deported to Guatemala and admitted his involvement in the assassination in 1986. Oswald either wasn't supposed to survive the assassination or wasn't supposed to be taken into custody. In my opinion, something went wrong, and he ended up alive and well capable of spilling the beans on the entire operation. So my guess is that someone in the CIA called their contact in the mafia and told them, "Hey, listen, I got good news and bad news. Kennedy's dead, that went well, but Oswald's still alive, and he's in police custody. So, as you can imagine, if he starts running his mouth, we're all dead." To which the mafia guy said something like, "Hey, yo, forget about it. I know a guy." That guy was Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner from Chicago with ties to Sam Giancana of the Chicago mob. He made his way into the Dallas police station garage when they were transferring Oswald to the county jail and fired one shot into his abdomen. He died a few hours later. Ruby was tried and convicted of Oswald's murder and died in prison 3 years later at the age of 55. So you can see how Oswald, Ruby, David Ferrie, the Mafia, the CIA, and Cubans all had suspicious connections that would appear to dispel the lone gunman theory. For many years, the doctors who worked on Kennedy at Parkland Hospital that day said that the wound in the back of his head was an entrance wound, supporting the lone gunman theory. But in recent years, several of them have come forward to state that they were ordered to say that under threat of losing their medical license, and that it was, in fact, an exit wound, indicating that the shot came from in front of the limo. Also, several key witnesses and suspects ended up dead within 3 years of the assassination, including David Ferrie, who died in 1967 at the age of 48, within a week of a New Orleans newspaper running a story on the assassination conspiracy investigation. Guy Bannister, Grant Stockdale, Gary Underhill, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Dorothy Kilgallen, among others, all died unexpectedly. You can Google those names and read up on them. Robert Kennedy Jr. has publicly stated his belief that the CIA was behind JFK's assassination. President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to have all of the documents on the investigation released to the public after he's inaugurated. Hopefully, he'll make good on that promise. This is hardly an exhaustive presentation on the story. I could do dozens of videos on everything from Oswald's days in Russia to Clay Shaw and the New Orleans connection to Jim Garrison's over-the-top rhetoric to the other people who were taken into custody that day. I'm only scratching the surface here. I'm going to include lots of links in the description for you to follow up on what I've shared. When I was a student at Rhema, Kenneth Hagin was teaching one day on John 16:13, where Jesus said that the Holy Spirit would show us things to come. He said that the night when Kennedy was announced as the winner of the 1960 presidential election, he saw a quick vision of Kennedy falling over. He couldn't tell if he'd had a heart attack or if he'd been shot. All he knew was that he was dead. He turned to the people in the room with him and said, "He won't survive his first term." In 1963, shortly before the assassination, Brother Hagin was speaking at a Full Gospel Businessmen's meeting in New Mexico, and he shared a vision of impending judgment coming upon America.
For there came a dark hand up out of the ocean, from the east, even the Atlantic Ocean. It came up out of the sea as a hand. And as it rose up into the air, it became a dark cloud. And it filled the whole atmosphere. And yea, it swept inward like a storm from sea. And I said, "O Lord, O Lord, O Lord, what's the meaning of this?" And he spake unto me and said, "Son, that is the darkness of atheistic communism that is sweeping across the nation, even in the minds of men in high places and politicians with great power. And this nation shall not grow more strong, and ye shall never have more liberty than you have now, but liberties that you've known, as you have seen them seized, shall be seized, and shall be taken from you." And I looked again, and I could see upon the mountain a blot, as though a bottle of ink had been spilled, and it spread out over several states in the south and east. And then I looked, and I could see spots, splotched all over the mountain. And I said, "Lord, what meaneth this?" And he said, "Communistic inspired hatred among races shall cause greater turmoil than your nation has seen heretofore.
I believe that Kennedy's assassination triggered a chain of events that threatened to destroy the country. The Vietnam War escalated, leaving 58,000 U.S. troops dead, 150,000 wounded, and over 20,000 disabled. War protests spread to college campuses like Kent State in Ohio, where 4 students were killed after being fired upon by National Guard troops. Dr. King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. The Watergate scandal led to Nixon's resignation. The economy was in a shambles due to mismanagement and political upheaval. From 1964 to 1982, the Dow chart was essentially flat. Inflation rates caused the prime rate to skyrocket to over 20%. Sexual promiscuity and the rise in drug abuse led to a stark increase in sexually transmitted diseases and HIV/AIDS. So often when watching TV shows from the pre-assassination era like Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver, or the Dick Van Dyke Show, we envisioned that as a more wholesome, moral period where people saluted the flag, said their prayers, and obeyed the law. In reality, America was rotten to the core. The Klan was burning church buildings and lynching black people. Jim Crow laws denied constitutional rights to people who were born as U.S. citizens. The Supreme Court banned school prayer in 1962. The mafia was running a good percentage of the nation's commerce and rubbing people out who interfered. The CIA was removing democratically elected heads of state and propping up anti-communist despots in their place. John and Bobby Kennedy were both notorious womanizers. LBJ was a crook with his own alleged personal hitman, Malcolm Wallace. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was a bisexual. Rock Hudson, one of the leading men in Hollywood, was a homosexual. The government conducted unethical tests on unwitting African American men in the Tuskegee experiment to study the effects of syphilis. And the Dallas Police Department was corrupt, with most of the men on the force frequenting clubs like the Carousel Club owned by Jack Ruby. The family entertainment of American TV was basically the spiritual equivalent of putting lipstick on a pig. At the same time, a move of God had begun in 1959, known as the Charismatic Movement, as denominational pastors began to speak in tongues, pray for the sick, and operate in spiritual gifts. David Wilkerson began preaching to drug addicts and gang members in inner cities, which launched a global ministry called Teen Challenge. People were horrified by the prospects of nuclear war and Armageddon and began to seek God, which led to the Jesus movement of the late 60s to the mid-70s. So despite the consequences of America's sins, the grace of God was manifested across the land as people saw the futility of man's ways in defiance of God's truth. As the Bible says, where sin abounds, grace abounds even more, Romans 5:20. Which leads me to a final thought. 2,000 years ago, there was a different assassination. The King of the Jews was crucified as an insurrectionist when the Jewish people were stirred up by their leaders to demand his death. And there was a conspiracy theory then, too. After Jesus rose from the dead, a rumor spread that Jesus' disciples stole his body. That makes no sense, of course, because most of them were put to death for preaching his resurrection rather than recanting. If we draw any conclusion from the murder of JFK, it should be that man is sinful, and that the only cure for sin is the new life that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. Thanks for watching, and be blessed.